Good morning. It's fairly early here. I'm out in the woods and it's March 20th, the spring equinox. By the time you get this, it will be the day after the spring equinox. A bit of unfortunate timing there. And of course, if you're in the southern hemisphere, yesterday will have been the autumn equinox. Back in episode 7, I recommended marking the seasons. A good way of connecting with something that transcends our quotidian concerns. Our concerns about the uncertainty of the world right now, perhaps. Even though nature is under assault from human expansion and seems to be losing that war with the massive loss of habitat, be assured, nature always wins in the end. Humanity, so certain of its importance, is a blip. This planet has been effectively sterilised multiple times, and each time nature starts again carte blanche. And personally, I find something comforting in its irrepressibility. So as spring is the season of Dionysus, I suggest you connect with it. You can do this, of course, just by getting out in nature and looking out for that flush of growth that burgeons at this time of year. The shoots and the buds. Vegetation almost pushing itself into existence. Try and see that if you can. Try and see the push. As the season progresses, if you try and discern it, you will almost be able to see vegetation tumbling over itself all over the place. In super slow motion, of course. I mean, isn't a tree just a frozen explosion? If you're in the southern hemisphere, you might be able to see something similar with fungi snaking out of the soil. They thrive in those damp autumnal conditions. Among other things, Dionysus is the god of vegetation, diminishing in autumn and waking up in spring, just like the seasonal cycle. He dies and he rises again. Remind you of anyone? Dionysus is famously the god of wine, so you might take a little wine with you into the woods to enjoy. Just a little. Being able to enjoy an experience and let it pass without chasing the pleasure is important. Feel that little bit of disappointment when a good thing comes to an end. Engage with it. Remember, as we've discussed, suffering is an essential constituent of pleasure. Don't flee these little sufferings or try to combat them. To mark spring, think about having a special supper, cooking something seasonal, or better yet, something foraged. The wild garlic is just coming up here. Great for soup, pesto and salad too, especially the frothy white flowers, but they won't appear until around June. Nettles too are actually delicious and are popping up all over the place right now. People who haven't tried nettles tend to be horrified by the thought, but in actual fact, they're so much more delicious than spinach, and they look better in a dish because they are much more virulent green, and they're very good for you too, I understand. Maybe light a candle with your dinner if this is something you don't do ordinarily. Just something to make things feel a little different. What's the point of all this? Is it just a pagan-flavoured nice thing to do? Well, yes, it's that. And in fact, there's good evidence that connecting with nature is good for your mental health. But it's also a gentle rehearsal for forging a more profound connection with the non-human world, a breaking through and an epiphanic expansion of consciousness that dissipates that desperate, sad and lonely predicament the civilized human animal has condemned itself to. One of humans' most defining characteristics, the feeling of alienation. Alienation from nature. Alienation from the world. Alienation from other people. Alienation from its own self.
What does not kill me makes me stronger.
You have discovered the Becoming Ubermensch podcast. Becoming Übermensch is a resource for personal growth and transcendence based on the radical teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Welcome to the proudly AI-free Becoming Übermensch podcast. I raised AI because it's been on my mind this week. Had a couple of minor swipes at the show for using AI, and in at least one case this was directed at the introduction, which is actually voiced by my girlfriend Kelly. I note with interest that people are disparaging of the value of AI productions, and I kind of feel the same way actually. I think the idea that you can produce something on AI so quickly and easily and simply devalues it somewhat. It's quite simply the scarcity principle from marketing, whereby if something's widely available, its value decreases. So I have a friend of mine who sometimes sends me the odd poem, and I'm not particularly a fan of poetry, but I do tend to read them. But then sometimes he sends me a poem composed by AI, and to be honest, I can barely be bothered to read it to the end, because quite simply, you push a button and AI will produce a poem for you, but you could just push that button and get 100 more similar poems. So even if the poem's good, there's something about how it's produced that is intrinsically related to how valuable it is. So I want to assure you that this show is AI free. My girlfriend does exist. The music at the start of this podcast and at the end, that was composed by me. Admittedly, on GarageBand using loops, but it definitely wasn't AI because I did it several years ago. And all the scripting is done by me. It's been done over the last 7 years, actually. So there's almost no AI involvement at all. I wouldn't claim that I never use ChatGPT, things like that. I do. I think it's quite good for proofreading. I've been writing a book for a number of years and it's good at spotting errors in grammar, syntax. But it knows very little about Nietzsche. I wouldn't recommend that people use ChatGPT for Nietzsche because I think he delivers a very uninformed and basic understanding of his philosophy. Also, as you're no doubt aware, ChatGPT and the other large language model AI platforms tend to turn up incorrect responses and give you fallacious information. Personally, I've asked ChatGPT to help me locate a particular Nietzsche quote within his corpus of works, and it comes back with a citation, but the citation, when I check it, is completely wrong. So even as a research assistant, you have to go and check the answers that it produces, which makes it kind of useless as a research assistant. Anyway, back to the point. This is an AI-free podcast. Kelly does speak perfect English, but she's not digital. I can vouch for that after 19 years together. She exists as an organic being. Which brings us nicely onto our discussion for this week, actually. Power and the natural world. I did say last week that we would talk about Nietzsche's new hierarchy of needs, using the will to power. But in fact, that will be next time because there's more to say on this week's topic than I'd actually bargained for. Will to power in the organic. It's necessary to tackle this stuff before moving on to the hierarchy of needs. And that's why this week's show is called Nietzsche's Will to Power in Nature. In Beyond Good and Evil 13, Nietzsche claimed that, quote, life as such is will to power, unquote. So let's explore how will to power manifests itself in the biological realm, and let's really dissect that all-important concept, the one thing we all strive for in Nietzsche's view, power. But first, a recap from last week. Will to power as a psychological phenomenon in humans is not merely about dominance over others, but is the drive to overcome resistance, grow, and achieve mastery. It is deeper than just a psychological impulse. Nietzsche posits it as an observable principle of existence itself. Human motivation is structured around wanting things, striving for them, and experiencing the satisfaction of getting them. But satisfaction is fleeting, pushing us to seek ever greater challenges. The harder the resistance, the greater the pleasure of overcoming it. That's our resistance-reward principle. Unfortunately, success loses its thrill over time, so-called hedonic adaptation, and requires an endless succession of goals of increasing difficulty to maintain ever-increasing fulfillment. Hedonic escalation. At least if a human is to be as fulfilled as possible. So not only is the highest kind of fulfillment not free of suffering, it actually depends on suffering for its very possibility. For Nietzsche, this means we need a new, more healthy orientation to suffering, one that sees that it can be a positive force for life. To reject struggle is to reject life itself. Nietzsche condemns nihilistic attitudes that wish to escape the world simply because it contains pain. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil 225, quote, "Whatever of depth, mystery, mask, spirit, cunning, and greatness has been bestowed upon it," humanity means there, "has it not been bestowed through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering?" Unquote. And then in Twilight of the Idols 9.4, quote, "All becoming and growth, everything that guarantees the future involves pain." Unquote. No pain, no gain, as I guess is written on the wall of pretty much every gymnasium in the world. That reminds me actually, I heard the other day that there's some good evidence that pain that is willingly chosen hurts less than the same pain that is imposed upon you without your agreement. And of course that makes perfect sense. One good reason, I guess, to take a more positive approach to suffering. And we'll do a show on suffering at some point, I guess, because Nietzsche had a great deal to say about it. Now, bear in mind that this description of will to power as the pursuit of a succession of ever more challenging goals is an all things being equal dynamic. Real life is more complicated, with humans having lots of different goals all at the same time, often goals that directly conflict with one another, and more on that in later shows. And the picture is further confused by external imperatives and contingencies that impose themselves and further muddy the waters around the expression of this essential psychological dynamic, the dynamic of human psychological will to power. Last time we also noted that though this psychological will to power evolved because it contributed to survival for reproduction, like all instincts, it is blind, and so it does not aim at survival for reproduction. Its only activity is its own relentless expression. Just like your sex drive, for instance, which evolved for reproduction and over millions of years has reliably resulted in reproduction, but does not actually aim at reproduction. Your sex drive just aims at the fulfillment of its own impulse. And so, even protected sex, even masturbation, can suffice to mollify its demands. Similarly, your hunger drive, which evolved because it ensures nourishment, which supports survival for reproduction, but does not aim at nourishment. Your hunger only seeks the pleasure of eating tasty food and the amelioration of unpleasant hunger sensations. This is a crucial point, and it bears repeating. Instincts are not purposive, not teleological, they don't aim at goals. It is only the conscious thinking that we bring to bear in response to their demands that introduces concrete goals and employs abstract reasoning as the means to figuring out ways to fulfill those goals in response to the nagging demands of the instincts. So our conscious goals are proxies for deeper, unconscious, instinctive desires. Desires that always exist only because they evolved to serve survival for reproduction. But, I stress again, they don't aim at it. Confused? I hope not. Stick with it and listen again if necessary. I really think your investment will be richly rewarded. So knowing that we are puppets of our will to power, I've suggested that managing its non-specific demands is prudent. So how do we manage this irrepressible will to power drive? Well, by using our will to power, of course. The most refined and exalted expression of will to power is in commanding one's self, and to quote Nietzsche again, quote, "He who cannot obey himself will be commanded," unquote. And that's from Zarathustra. So we've talked about will to power in human psychology. Let's now talk about that broader scope of will to power, the organic. How does will to power manifest itself biologically in all living things? It's pretty easy to observe it in human psychology. It's something we feel and experience, steering our behaviour towards overcoming resistances, motivating a range of conscious desires. But what about our more animal desires? The motivated desires that are more specific and practical and do not seem to have to involve the pleasure of overcoming resistance for its own sake. The kind of desires that all complex animals share. In non-human animals, there seems to be little evidence of our kind of psychological will to power that compels them to overcome resistances purely for the satisfaction of doing so. I'll go out on a limb and wager that your dog isn't into base jumping, or any other adrenaline sports for that matter. Although, now I think about it, I have seen dogs skateboarding and surfing online. But I bet your cat doesn't have an ambition to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The instincts we share with other animals for things like eating, mating, personal hygiene, emotional bonding with offspring, and hostility to intruders doesn't seem to require a will-to-power meta-drive. For example, eating food when we are hungry is its own pleasurable reward. We don't need an extra hedonic incentive on top that makes us feel good just for obtaining something to eat. On the other hand, denying ourselves food when we're hungry, say because we're on a diet or a religious fast, is an expression of psychological will-to-power, because we are privileging the satisfaction of overcoming resistance, whether it be for health reasons or religious reasons. In this case, we are battling our compulsion to eat, privileging our abstinence over the pleasure we would get from eating. We want, in fact, two conflicting things in such a case. We want to eat and we want to not eat, and which one we will choose will tell us which desire was strongest in the end. We don't see animals dieting or denying themselves food just for the sake of exercising their self-control, and that's because they don't really have psychological will to power like we do. It's an almost uniquely human trait, and Nietzsche has a plausible account to explain why this is the case. Now, as we've said, these instinctive animal behaviours support, and indeed evolved for, survival for reproduction. But if everything organic is will to power, as Nietzsche claims, how can they be understood as its manifestations? Nietzsche states that we should, quote, resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, severity, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and, at the least and mildest, exploitation, unquote. And that's from Beyond Good and Evil 259. Well, the axiomatic imperative for life itself that provides the grounding of all instinct is survival for reproduction. So let's see how that relates to will to power as Nietzsche outlines it. To begin with, survival is obviously the precondition for reproduction. You're not going to sire any offspring if you don't exist. Surviving means to endure, to keep existing, to persist. To continue to exist isn't a passive deal, it generally requires a lot of work. To exist and persist is the most basic form of power and the precondition for all other varieties of power. For living organisms, existence requires meeting certain critical conditions. Chief among these is obtaining sufficient nourishment. For all animal life, this nourishment must come from consuming the bodies of other living things. Organic matter, whether it's animal or vegetable, is ground up, ingested, and incorporated to maintain and develop the animal structures and fuel the activities of life. Because resources are finite, securing nourishment frequently involves competition. One must outpace, outmaneuver, or sometimes overwhelm others vying for those same resources. These are clear expressions of power. The cheetah that successfully chases down and kills a gazelle demonstrates its power over its unfortunate prey. The act of devouring the gazelle, of breaking down its tissues and repurposing them, is the appropriation of its power. The meat is fuel, which is energy, which is power. A cheetah that constantly fails in the chase is weak and will get weaker. If you think about it, even seemingly passive activities such as rest and sleep concern power, its conservation and its regeneration. Or take personal hygiene. Almost all animals groom themselves. This is an impulse that serves health, getting rid of harmful parasites and dead skin that could harbour infections. And what is health but power? Once food is procured and a spell of continued survival safeguarded, reproduction becomes the next imperative. This also tends to embroil organisms in competition, this time for mates. Reproductive rights must be fought for, territories must be won and held, displays of fitness performed to attract partners. Here again, we see power. And how about that competitive race in which only a single sperm from among billions gets to fertilise the egg? And the extraordinary creative power of biology, transforming a single cell into the intricate bodies of offspring. Following reproduction, once a brood of young has been produced, organisms may need to feed, protect and nurture their young to ensure they reach independence and have a fighting chance of reproducing themselves and passing on their inherited genes. We cosseted humans forget too easily. This is a race for life, and the devil take the hindmost. Growth itself, whether of an individual, an offspring, a colony, or an expanding genetic lineage, is an expression of power. This dynamic is not limited to animals. Plants engage in their own power struggles, as becomes only too apparent when we see speeded-up footage of a rainforest and the continual wrestling that transpires at a pace so slow it's normally invisible to us. A tree that grows taller than its neighbours monopolises sunlight and starves its competitors below. Roots do battle underground, snaking through the soil to capture water and nutrients. Even fungi exhibit behaviour that can be identified as power in expression. Mycelial networks infiltrate and decompose organic matter, transforming entire ecosystems to their advantage. What about that parasitic fungus, Ophiocordyceps, something that can manipulate its host's behaviour for its own reproductive benefit? It can infect an insect and make of it a slave that sacrifices its own life to complete the fungus's reproductive cycle. This too is as much an expression of power as is the predator hunting on the savannah. Asexual species are not exempt from these struggles. Without the competition for mates, their productive power expresses itself directly in their ability to replicate prolifically. Single-celled organisms like bacteria divide themselves, processing environmental resources to reproduce as much as conditions allow. In this capacity for replication, growth and domination of ecological niches, we see a form of power, the unrelenting, animating drive for persistence, replication, colonization and expansion. Ask yourself, all things being equal, does an organism seek resources in order to reproduce, or does it reproduce as much as the available resources will allow? Which strategy is likely to prevail in evolutionary terms? Even symbiotic relationships, often painted in the most harmonious hues, are expressions of power struggles, a strategic equilibrium where organisms trade resources or services to maximize their own fitness. Mycorrhizal fungi, for instance, colonize plant roots, extracting sugars in exchange for nutrients. Similarly, the near eradication of gutworms in humans has been linked to rising allergy rates, suggesting that these parasites once exacted a tithe from our food while offering protection against harmful compounds in return. Whether or not this theory holds, it nicely illustrates how symbiotic relationships evolve through necessity, with organisms adapting to one another until they may become mutually indispensable, the other becoming a fact of the environment within which the means of survival must be secured. But it is a stretch, I suggest, to call this power equivalence a partnership. Does anyone want to invite their gutworms back? Yet it seems we sometimes need our enemies. In like fashion, you cannot live without your gut biome, those teeming microorganisms essential to your digestion. But that same biome would start digesting you if its ambition were not constrained. Such relationships exemplify power in mutual dependency, a productive standoff where each holds the other in check and both benefit. In some unfortunate people, the digestive system's protective system fails and their gut biomes break out and do start digesting their host. Here we see how a natural expression of directedness towards power can actually endanger the organism itself. In this case, the productive equilibrium between the host and the biome has been catastrophically interrupted, and so the biome kills its host and thereby seals its own doom. It's a Mexican standoff where, if one of the gunslingers fires, everybody ends up dead. This happens because the constraints within which an organism's impulses evolved have been removed, and, as I continue to stress, their directedness towards power is not purposive. It is merely compelled to express itself. And yet we love to romanticize these friendly bacteria. Does anyone really imagine symbiotic relationships are underpinned by goodwill, an altruistic regard for the other party? To think so is to anthropomorphize nature, impressing our fondness for agreeableness onto a world where brute necessity, not benevolence, governs coexistence. You might counter that I am just as guilty of this too. Aren't my descriptions of the behaviour of animals, plants and fungi just as anthropomorphic? Does a tree really express power when it grows? Does a herd of zebras or a colony of bacteria when they multiply? In answer to this accusation that the designation of these things as examples of power is anthropocentric, I answer, yes, you're absolutely right. It is. I will go so far as to claim that all descriptions of power phenomena are anthropocentric. The difference is that when we infer goodwill in symbiotic relationships, we are psychologizing about the motives of organisms. When I point to power expressions in the organic, I am merely describing observable physical phenomena using a human abstract concept. Power isn't something in the world. It's a description of the character of particular objects or events from our perspective. Concepts tell us more about us humans than they do about the world. So when people talk of symbiosis as cooperation, with that implicit suggestion of mutual goodwill, they are inferring motives. To make attributions of power is merely to describe. Motive doesn't come into it. Does a tree seek power? Not really, at least not in the way we would recognise. But does power require intentionality, purposiveness? No. We've already said that will to power is not goal-oriented. It merely does what it does. So we may be able to describe all sorts of unconscious and perhaps even inorganic processes as expressions of power. You've witnessed a thunderstorm before that can quite legitimately be called powerful. Is there any motive there? Does the storm have a purpose? Of course not. So a tree can be seen to express power even though there is no intentionality in it, at least not in any way we would normally recognise. This raises questions about our definition of power, and I'll return to that in a moment. Turning back to humans, you are a product of the power of your parents. Their survival into reproductive maturity, their ability to secure resources, attract a mate, and successfully raise you to adulthood, all are expressions of their power. In contemporary human societies, the challenge of reproducing and raising offspring may be an unremarkable achievement, supported as it is by systems of collective power. Yet even this is a manifestation of will to power, the power of our societies to mitigate infant mortality and provide for the development of their members, growing the society and promoting its health and vitality. A society that loses most of its children to malnutrition or disease would not be considered powerful. It would be considered weak. On these terms, the so-called circle of life is a ruthless power economy. Birdsong is the most charming music, but it's also a warning. Fruit is a delicious treat, but it's also a bribe. Flowers are pretty, but they lie. Sexual desire is pure sensual intoxication, but it's also a trap. Symbiosis is a temporary equilibrium. Everything is temporary. A temporary equilibrium in what is otherwise the bellum hominum contra omnes, the war of all against all. To live is to seek power and to express it, not merely to persist, but to expand, transform, impose, dominate and overcome in the pursuit of more power. If this sounds bleak, don't worry, we'll fix that in later shows. The world may be a meat grinder, but it's also a beautiful garden. And the beautiful garden is a meat grinder. And the meat grinder is a beautiful garden. And you cannot have the one without the other. And, in fact, they are the exact same thing. Imagine. For living things to survive, defend, compete, flourish, reproduce, grow, expand, and exploit is to express will to power. This dynamic is structural, morphological, physiological, and behavioural. Nature doesn't consciously make bids for power. Only humans really do that with their singular, freakishly bloated consciousnesses. The herd increasing in size is will to power, but the herd doesn't consciously seek to increase its size. The tree reaching for the sun is will to power, but the tree doesn't consciously reach for the sun. A tree isn't conscious. The tiger hunting the boar is will to power, but the tiger doesn't consciously hunt in order to nourish itself. It hunts because it has an evolved urge to do so. This is why domestic cats kill small creatures even when they are well fed. The drive to hunt and the drive to feed dovetail nicely, having evolved together, but they are separable instinctive drives that seek expression independently. Now, beware. Don't be fooled by this talk of will to power as if it's some sort of thing, some kind of mysterious, invisible force operating in the organic. It isn't. Many get tripped up thinking of will to power as some kind of vitalistic force. Will to power is instead just the way things work together in the organic world, and perhaps beyond. We'll take a closer look at power after this important message.
The Becoming Übermensch project is a new and tender green shoot striving towards the light. If it's going to thrive, it needs the sunshine and gentle rain of your support. If you find this material of value, help us to help you by doing a few simple things. Hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook and X. Search Becoming Übermensch, all one word. Drop us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you know people who'd get something from this podcast, please do share it with them. Your support makes all the difference and can help this project survive and flourish.
Perhaps you feel I've been playing fast and loose with the definition of power here. Defining power is more tricky than it at first appears. Consult a few dictionaries and you'll find that power is defined in ways that are not at odds with the examples I've cited. Their consensus is that power is energy. It's the ability, capacity, or potential to do some work or have some effect. Power is the ability to do stuff, to exert control, to be able to get what you want and need. What dictionaries generally overlook is that its meaning might best be found in the perceiving subject rather than in the perceived phenomena. Power, like beauty, a not unrelated concept, is in the eye of the beholder. Power is identified by its effects on us. It's a kind of value judgment. That which imposes, inspires, thrills, endangers, frightens, compels, evokes awe, seizes control. That which we want for ourselves is power. A terrifying storm, a pungent scent, a muscular body, a concussing blow, a rousing speech, a captivating work of art. These experiences are powerful because they press themselves into our reality, whether we want them or not. Power is relational. Power is simply a quality of any cause that has significant effects. The more its effects intrude, the greater we deem the power to be. But every cause produces effects, is its effects, and so all effect is power, to a degree contingent on the evaluation of the perceiver. The most basic form of power, then, is to exist. All other power expressions require this precondition. Whether it be a cultural meme, a species, a nation, a galaxy, or a law of physics, surviving, enduring, adapting, outcompeting, having effects, existing and persisting is to instantiate power. It is to be the boxer still standing when the current round ends. Power is growth, expansion and development. And of course that is exactly what we see in the organic world. Not just through reproduction, but colonization, diversification, appropriation, and increasing morphological complexity. Who decides what is and isn't powerful? We do. What makes it powerful? The intensity of its effects on us. Power is in the eye of the beholder. The powerful cannot be ignored. That which goes ignored is not powerful. Now, you might concede that the growth of a tree could be described as an expression of power, but as it is not conscious, its activity could hardly be described as will to power. A tree does not will. The same with most organic life, and the same with our thunderstorm and all such natural phenomena. Well, we've analysed Nietzsche's concept of power. I guess we should do the same with his concept of will. But that's for another time. Let's turn instead to this week's music choice, and then we'll sum up. Nietzsche is the philosopher of the aesthetic and of feeling. And so here's this week's track that I think reflects the moods and emotions of this Becoming Übermensch project. So I invite you to have your own feeling experience framed within the project we're exploring whilst listening to Rausch 5 by Gas. There's an inexorable rhythmic drive to this track that evokes for me thoughts of nature at its most unstoppable and at its most implacable. Quite a haunting piece. Links, as always, in the show's description. Do share your thoughts on how this track made you feel. I'd be really interested in hearing about your impressions. Before the summary, a couple of notices. Firstly, this is episode 10, and we're going to be moving to fortnightly in terms of producing the podcast, as I need to earn a crust, and until such time as this podcast can be self-sustaining, it'll need to take a backseat to some of the inescapable necessities of life, unfortunately. And a not unrelated point, you can now support the show materially if you're able to, thereby ensuring its continuity. Either you can click the support the show button in the show's description, or you can subscribe on Patreon as a member of De Profundis. De profundis means out of the depths or from the abyss. It's Latin, and that's going to be a membership option for people who are interested in a deep dive into some of these Nietzschean questions. And I'm hoping that if I get some subscribers, I will be providing some extra and exclusive content. And again, if you are interested in becoming a De Profundis member, please check the description on this show. Either way, I very much appreciate your support. And if you're not in a position to support financially, I understand times are hard, but it can really help us if you like, share, comment, review, so on and so forth. If you like this material, if it's of value to you and you want to keep receiving it, please help us to continue producing it. So thank you. And with that, let's sum up. So here's your summary. Aside from human psychological will to power, which is the meta drive to overcome resistances, we and other complex animals have more basic instinctive drives. These too are expressions of will to power. How so? Well, remember, human psychological will to power is a faculty that evolved only because it contributes to the survival for reproduction of genes, despite the fact that, like all instinctive drives, it doesn't aim at survival for reproduction. The instinctive drives too evolved only for survival for reproduction. Survival for reproduction involves maintaining one's existence, which is itself a struggle to obtain resources, avoid danger, sustain and improve health, all of which are expressions of power. To perish is the catastrophic loss of one's power. To survive is, at the very least, to conserve the power you already possess. Of course, both survival and reproduction tend to be matters of fierce competition, which implies a power struggle, even where it doesn't involve combat. For instance, the peacock with his stunning tail is chosen by the peahen because his fine tail signals his superior genes. This means his genes are better at getting themselves replicated. That's power to proliferate right there. Power as growth potential. Regarding reproduction, many organisms will actively put themselves in danger or even sacrifice their lives completely in order to have a chance of passing on their genes. Not just the conspicuous plumage of some tropical birds like the peacock, but consider the fate of some male spiders being eaten by the female after copulation. To achieve the transmission and proliferation of one's genes can be seen as an expression of power, even if one loses one's life in the process. Survival for reproduction, then, is the drive to succeed in existing, persisting, and prevailing in the competition for gene transmission. This is what all the instinctive drives of living organisms are directed towards. Remember, they don't aim at it actively. Their directedness is explained retrospectively by the fact that previous generations that happened to be so directed tended to be successful at reproducing. And it's their genes that were passed on and are present and active in the current generation, determining the instinctive drives that govern the current generation's behaviour. For living things to survive, overpower, consume, defend, escape predators, outcompete, flourish, reproduce, grow, expand, and exploit is to express will to power. On these terms, power is a value judgment, and it's a value judgment we make about phenomena in the world. Power is observable in effects. But of course, everything has effects, and so everything is power in principle. It's merely a question of degree. When the effects are significant to us, that's when we recognize a phenomenon as powerful. You might concede that natural phenomena are expressions of power on these terms, but it may seem a stretch to call them will to power. Will suggests the kind of purposive, teleological, goal-directedness that I've taken the trouble to separate from the activity of our instinctive drives. Yes, but we have to understand what Nietzsche means by will. All will, including yours and mine too. And on that, let me leave you with this final thought from Nietzsche. With it and everything we've discussed so far, you have all the tools you need to understand will to power right down to the bottom. All it requires of you is that you make one short but extremely momentous intellectual leap. Nietzsche talks of will in the following terms in several places, but here I'm going to quote Will to Power 488. Nietzsche, the philosopher and promulgator of the Will to Power doctrine, writes, quote, "There is no such thing as will," unquote.